The chainsaws started at 5:40 in the morning, and by the time I got my boots on and hit the back door, the first of my 3 white oaks was already coming down. It hit the ground with a sound I felt in my chest. 200 years of tree folding into the dew. And I stood there in the half-light, watching a crew in hard hats limit while a second saw bit into the next one. And up the slope, on the cedar veranda that looked down over my property toward the lake, my neighbor Trevor Lang stood in a bathrobe with a coffee mug, filming the whole thing on his phone. When he saw me, he lifted the mug in a little toast. My name is Dan Crow. I was 50 that spring, and I have spent 25 years as a certified arborist and a licensed appraiser of trees and timber loss, which means I spent a good chunk of my career as the expert witness who tells a courtroom exactly what a felled tree was worth. Trevor filmed my oaks coming down like it was a fireworks show. A month later, I was playing that same video for an investigator. He just didn't know it yet. I did not run up that hill. I have learned that the man who throws the first punch hands the other man the whole case. And besides, I had better tools than my hands. I walked to each stump, still weeping sap, and I did what I do. I photographed them with a GPS tag. I counted rings on the fresh cuts, and I pulled a tape across the trunk collars while the crew boss watched me like I was the crazy one. 210 rings on the biggest. When the boss finally strolled over and waved a laminated sheet at me and said the words, "Approved view and fire safety easement, take it up with the board," I didn't argue with him. I photographed the sheet too. And then Trevor called down across the property line, grinning, sure he'd already won, and gave me the single most expensive sentence of his life. "That lake view adds 90 grand to my place, Dan. Your trees were in the way." He said it in full daylight, 40 feet away, while my phone was recording. I have learned that the universe occasionally hands you a gift, and that the polite thing to do is say nothing and accept it. Here is what Trevor Lang, 49, uphill neighbor and proud member of the Lakeshore Point Architectural and Fire Safety Committee, did not understand about the man he'd just robbed. I count rings and I count dollars for a living. That night, I built the appraisal the way I'd build one for a trial, the trunk formula technique the courts accept, replacement value against species and size and condition, and the number for 3 heritage white oaks came to a little over $140,000 before anyone said the word penalty. Then I pulled the county records, because the second thing I do for a living is read them, and there was no recorded easement. None. No vista easement, no fire safety easement, nothing on my parcel granting anyone the right to touch a single branch. What there was, buried in the association's own minutes, was a resolution pushed through the committee that Trevor Lang personally chaired, authorizing hazard vegetation management on a lot that wasn't his, over a signature line where my consent should have been and wasn't. I sent a certified cease and desist to the board and to Trevor by name that morning. Their answer arrived 3 days later, and it was not an apology. It was a fine, to me, for $200, for unsightly stumps and disruption of community landscaping standards. They cut down my oaks and fined me for the stumps. I laughed out loud in my own kitchen, because sometimes the confidence of these people is genuinely a kind of art. That was the day the war went door to door, and Trevor, who had the HOA as a weapon, started swinging it every way he could. A compliance officer began appearing on my property line with a clipboard, citing me for the stumps, then for my truck, then for a woodpile, a new fine every few days, all of them signed off by the committee Trevor sat on. So I answered the only way that stays legal and still draws blood. I stopped doing Trevor any favors. For years, I'd let the community's storm drainage run through a culvert on the back of my land, and I'd maintained a low retaining berm on my own property that happened to hold the toe of Trevor's slope in place, and none of that was in any recorded easement either. I had my own survey to prove it. So I posted my land, I put cameras on the corners, and I notified the association in writing that unauthorized drainage across my parcel would cease. My land, my water, my berm. Trevor called the sheriff on me that same afternoon, reporting an aggressive neighbor threatening community infrastructure. A deputy came out, and I laid my deed and the county GIS on his hood and showed him the property line, and he walked up the hill and told Trevor Lang that where his drainage ran was a civil matter, and that a man managing his own land wasn't a 911 call. It would not be the last time a deputy made that drive. For the next 2 weeks, Trevor and I fought a war measured in feet and paperwork, and he started it fresh every morning. His compliance officer took to walking my property line at 7, photographing my stumps and my truck, and once, memorably, my recycling bin. And each visit produced a new citation on committee letterhead, $400, then 6, then a daily accruing fine that told me exactly how badly Trevor wanted me buried. So I read my own survey again and found the pressure point he'd forgotten. Trevor reached the community's little boat dock by a gravel path that clipped the northeast corner of my lot, a path with no recorded easement, a path I had let 3 families use for years out of pure neighborliness. Neighborliness was over. I posted that corner, ran a cable and a gate across it on my own ground, and mailed the association written notice that the crossing was closed. Trevor came down to the fence that evening, redder than I'd ever seen him, and we stood 18 inches apart with the wire between us, while he told me I couldn't do that, and I told him to show me the easement that said I couldn't. He couldn't, because there wasn't one. So he did the thing he always did and called the sheriff, this time to report that I was denying residents lake access. The same tired deputy rolled up, read my survey for the 3rd time that month, and told Trevor Lang that a gravel path across a man's private corner was that man's to close. Trevor stood in the dusk and watched a deputy explain his own overreach back to him, and I went inside and made coffee, which felt like the right note. Then the rain came, and the rain did what I could not, because it turned out my oaks had been doing a job nobody up the hill had ever thought about. Those root systems had held that slope for 2 centuries, and the fire safety clearing Trevor had bragged about had stripped the anchor right out of the hillside under his own veranda. The first real storm carved a gully down the bare slope. The drainage I'd lawfully cut off backed up and found a new path, and a section of Trevor's manicured Lakeview yard slid about 4 feet toward the water, taking a corner of his patio with it. I stood in my backyard under an umbrella and watched the view he'd killed my trees for start sliding down toward the lake. And I will be honest with you, I did not rush to help. What I did do was document it, as an engineer's habit and an arborist's satisfaction both, because the erosion proved my point better than any expert I could hire. The trees had been holding the hill. Their own fire safety story had just collapsed, literally, into a mudslide. When the county drainage inspector finally walked that bare, sliding slope, he cited the association for uncontrolled runoff and unpermitted grading, a fire safety project that had manufactured a genuine hazard where there had never been one. And this time, it was me who called the county, reporting the crew that had come back to haul the last of my oak logs off as criminal mischief and theft. Because those weren't fire safety trimmings on that flatbed. That was merchantable white oak, and it was leaving. They tried to move the rest of it under cover of dark, and that night is the one that finished Trevor, though he didn't feel it yet. A little after 10, the timberline flatbed rolled back in without its lights to grab the good logs still staged at the tree line before I could get a quart to freeze them, and I was already awake, because a man who films everything sleeps light. I didn't block the truck with my body. I blocked it with a phone and a neighbor. I stood on my own land recording the loader while my neighbor from 2 doors down stood beside me doing the same, and I called the county to report theft of timber in progress. Trevor, watching from his veranda, called it in too, reporting trespassers harassing a work crew, which was a bold framing for a man whose crew was stealing lumber off someone else's dirt at 10 at night. When the deputy arrived to 2 dueling calls, he asked the crew boss the one question that ends these things. Where's your authorization to be on this parcel? And the boss, a tired man who had clearly not been paid enough to catch a felony for Trevor Lang, said the words that unspooled the whole scheme. Lang told us to get the good logs out before the weekend. Take it up with him. On camera, on the dispatch log, the load stayed. And the next morning, I started following where the earlier loads had already gone. Following the logs is where the whole thing broke open. The crew belonged to an outfit called Timberline Clearing, and Timberline, it turned out, was tied to Trevor Lang through a business interest he'd never once disclosed to the board he voted on. And Timberline hadn't chipped my heritage oaks for hazard mulch. They'd sold them, as high-grade lumber, to a mill 2 counties over, and the receipts were exactly where receipts always are for a man who knows to look. So Trevor hadn't just cut my trees to buy himself a $90,000 view. He'd sold the trees on the way to the view and pocketed that too. When I laid the mill receipts next to the appraisal, the picture stopped being a property dispute and became a self-dealing board member profiting off the destruction of a neighbor's land under a fire safety pretext he'd manufactured himself. That was about when Marcia Clem, the board president who'd rubber-stamped Trevor's resolution, realized her signature was on a document authorizing a crime, and she found me at the community mailboxes and asked, quietly, to talk somewhere Trevor couldn't see. In my truck, she told me what I already suspected. Trevor had told the committee the easement was handled, that there was no fire hazard, that he'd wanted those trees gone for years, and that she'd signed because she was tired of fighting him. She gave me the emails. She gave me the whole thing. I filed for a temporary restraining order to stop any further clearing and to freeze the proceeds from the sold lumber, and the judge, looking at GPS stumps and mill receipts and a 200-year ring count, signed it fast. But I'd already decided a slow courtroom wasn't where this ended, because Trevor had toasted me with a coffee mug while my trees fell, and a debt that smug gets collected in public. Before the reckoning, though, I did one thing I wanted on the record. At the property line, with my camera running and 2 neighbors watching, I offered Trevor Lang the lawful way out, plainly. Pay the appraised value of the trees, restore the plantings, and I'd close the whole matter. No lawsuit, no criminal referral. Done. It was the cheap exit and the smart one, and I held it open with a straight face. Trevor looked at me the way you'd look at a stump and said, on camera, "It was an approved easement, Dan. I don't owe you $1." That refusal was the last free thing he did, because a man who turns down the reasonable offer in front of witnesses has just told a judge he chose the damage on purpose. And in timber trespass country, choosing it on purpose is how a number gets multiplied. The reckoning happened at the monthly Lakeshore Point meeting, where Trevor still thought he had the votes, and Marcia had quietly made sure I'd get the floor. I didn't raise my voice. I put the appraisal on the screen, $140,000 in heritage oak. I put up the ring count, 210 years, a tree older than the county. I put up the GPS map of the stumps and the mill receipts showing where my fire hazard had been sold as lumber, and the business filing tying Timberline to Trevor. Then I played 2 clips. The first was Trevor on his veranda, coffee mug raised, directing the crew and laughing as my oaks came down, his own phone footage that a neighbor had helpfully reshared. The second was Trevor at the fence line saying the view added 90 grand and my trees were in the way. You could hear the folding chairs shift, and then Marcia Clem stood up on her own and told the room that there had never been a fire hazard, that there was no recorded easement, and that Trevor had pushed the resolution through, knowing both. Somebody near the front said, "Timber trespass." Somebody who'd clearly done some reading said, "Treble damages." And a motion to remove Trevor Lang from the board was on the floor before he could rebuild his face. It came apart the way a hollow tree does, all at once and from the inside. Under the state's timber trespass statute, cutting another person's trees without permission trebles the damages, and doing it knowingly keeps you from hiding behind any claim of honest mistake. So my $140,000 in oaks became a judgment north of $400,000. Assessed personally against Trevor Lang because an association's insurance does not cover a board member's intentional destruction of a neighbor's property for personal profit. The undisclosed timberline interest and the sold lumber went to the Warren County District Attorney as a theft and self-dealing referral. And a referral like that does not go away because a man resigns his committee seat, which Trevor did anyway, along with Marcia, while Blue Line Community Management terminated the Lakeshore Point contract rather than explain in discovery how it had processed a fine for stumps it helped create. And here is the part I'd been saving. With the judgment paid, I planted a double row of fast-growing hybrid poplars and evergreens along our shared line. A living wall, permitting and all, entirely on my own land and entirely within my rights. Within 2 seasons, Trevor Lang's $90,000 Lakeview was a solid green fence, and the slope he'd stripped kept creeping toward the water every rainy season, undermining the very patio he'd built to enjoy the view he no longer had. He wanted to see the lake over my dead trees. Now he sees my new ones, and I've made my peace with that. Author's note, stepping in for a minute, because this one is almost a fable about greed. Trevor Lang didn't lose because he wanted a view. Plenty of people want a view. He lost because he treated a committee seat as a license to take something a deed said wasn't his, and then made it worse at every turn. The fatal detail is that he filmed it himself. Vanity handed the prosecution its best exhibit. A man on his veranda, coffee in hand, directing the destruction of a neighbor's 200-year-old oaks and bragging it was worth 90 grand. Everything that sank him was self-inflicted. A fire safety clearing that stripped the slope and slid his own yard into the lake. A hazard removal that turned up as graded lumber with his business partner's name on the ticket. A record showing no easement ever existed. And a refusal, on camera, of the one fair deal that could have saved him, which is what turned a big number into a multiplied one. Takeaways. Mature trees have real, appraisable dollar value, and many states treble the damages for cutting what isn't yours. Get a certified arborist's appraisal before you settle anything. And never accept the HOA approved it without seeing the recorded easement. A resolution is not a right. Question for you. Trevor turned down a clean settlement, and it cost him $250,000 more. So tell me below, was Dan's wall of trees justice, or did he owe his neighbor that view back?